It's a pleasure for me to welcome you to the first lecture in a series of 10 events that have been designed to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. What we have named Reformation 500 Corvallis has been organized with the support of Oregon State and several churches in our community to reflect the broad religious, cultural, musical, and artistic influences of the Protestant Reformation on Western culture. Our next event is an illustrated lecture by Joanna Lindell on Art of the Reformation. It will be illustrated, and it's next Tuesday at 7 p.m. in this very auditorium. Now you know where you are, and you'll now know where to come back to. We are privileged tonight to have as our speaker my colleague in history, Professor David Luft. David is holder of the Endowed Chair for the Humanities, the Horning Chair at Oregon State University, where he came in 2008. Dr. Luft holds his BA from Wesleyan. He received an MA and a PhD from Harvard. He is the author of 5 books, most recently, The Austrian Tradition in German Intellectual History, which is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. Professor Luft has held offices in a number of professional societies. He served as president of the Modern Austrian Literature and Culture Association and is past president of the Austria Studies Association. The beginning of the Protestant Reformation, of course, is observed every year on the 31st of October, Reformation Sunday, as it's often called, the day on which an unknown 34-year-old friar named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in the small town of Wittenberg, Germany. However, as Professor Luft will tell us tonight, the tide of reform in the church started many years, over 100 years before Luther, not in Germany, but in what is today Czechoslovakia, with an obscure priest by the name of Jan Hus. Dr. Luft's lecture tonight is called The Bohemian Reformation. Professor Luft.
Thanks, Gary. Good evening. Thank you all for being here this evening. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be part of our 500th Reformation, 500th anniversary Reformation series. Does this work now? Am I getting that right? Okay, thanks. Coming through? The Reformation was one of the defining events of American culture, and it is well worth our effort to understand it. My lecture tonight is also part of another series for the Horning Endowment for the Humanities on other Reformations, which aims to remind us of Reformations other than the German Lutheran Reformation. I hope you will watch for this series during the year as our speakers talk about Catholic reform, about the idea of Reformation, and about Reform Judaism. I have to get used to using this. This is where my story takes place. It's actually a lovely map, but hard to see probably. And this is the lecture series that I'll be doing that's slightly separate from the series we're at this evening. 5 or 6 years ago, I discovered that one of the greatest moments in the history of Christianity occurred just to the south of what we now call Germany, and about 100 years before what we call the Reformation. It was one of those great renovating events of world history, and it is almost unknown to Americans. It was hardly mentioned to me when I studied modern European and German history at Harvard. I don't think that my father ever mentioned it in his Presbyterian version of the Reformation, despite the fact that the Reformation of John Huss was considerably indebted to the English. Some people know it today as the Moravian Reformation, but it actually began in Bohemia, next door to Moravia, and few people realize how amazing and expansive these events were. Frederick G. Hyman, perhaps the greatest historian of the Czech century that began in 1415, calls it, quote, by all odds, one of the greatest dynamic movements for socio-political and spiritual freedom in all of history. And yet Germans and Americans seem to have little awareness of the Bohemians, or let's say the Hussite Reformation, to specify it a bit more. In celebration of Luther's Reformation, I want to tell you about these earlier events and about John Huss, whom Luther very much admired. He was surprised when he ran across Huss's work and wondered why nobody had ever told him about it. We have been taught to think about the Reformation as a 16th century story, but I want to encourage you today to remember a 15th century story. We have all heard that the Reformation happened in Germany. As they used to say in vaudeville, that's true, practically true, except it wasn't Germany, it was Bohemia. And it wasn't in German, it was in Czech. And it wasn't Martin Luther, it was John Huss. That's true, practically true. In vaudeville, they say it much better than that. Perhaps the greatest figure of Czech history, John Huss, 1369 to 1415, confronted the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire at the Council of Constance in 1415. And the enormous impact of his life and death led to Bohemia's near independence from the Holy Roman Empire in the 15th century. Huss was influenced by John Wycliffe's ideas, and intellectual developments in Bohemia were similar in some respects to the English experience in the 14th century. But the struggle in Bohemia for evangelical reform of the Bohemian Church was quite individual and extraordinary. I should just add here a note of caution about these events and the ways we've come to talk about them. We identify them with individual figures like John Huss, but that's really just a shorthand for a much broader process, just as it is with Luther, or let's say in our own day, Martin Luther King Jr. There's always a much broader event that we're referring to with this shorthand, without diminishing these individual figures. I think it's important to bear in mind that there were usually other similar figures in the area, and a longer history of the germination of these issues, as well as a sensitive response from people. If there weren't people out there to say, you've got that right, obviously we'd never hear about these things. It was not only that John Huss was Martin Luther before Luther, but Huss himself was part of a long tradition that was especially strong in Bohemia. In the 14th century, when there were actually two popes, it was widely understood that European Christendom was in crisis, and widely argued that the church should be ruled by councils rather than by a pope. In the midst of this spiritual crisis, the secular power was enjoying a renaissance in the Holy Roman Empire, whose capital at that time was in Prague. When Emperor Charles IV's daughter married Richard II of England in 1382, London was a step down from Prague, and Bohemia was a byword for chic. Not only was Prague geographically at the heart of Europe, but this was also true for politics, religion, and culture, even though most of Christian religious life was still conducted in Latin. The main thing I want to emphasize today is that the Bohemian Reformation happened at all 100 years before Martin Luther and John Calvin. Most Protestants are vaguely aware that there was a time in the Middle Ages when the papacy and Roman Catholicism were not doing well. The papacy had discredited itself by insisting on its sovereignty in the church, primarily its superiority to councils, and by its own corruption, culminating in the oxymoron of two supreme pontiffs and the embarrassment of the sale of indulgences. That time was the time of our story, a time when the unity of Christendom had already been achieved, when Italy, France, England, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire were all part of a common world, which was also the world in 1348 of the Black Plague. It was also in Prague that Emperor Charles IV founded the first university in Central Europe, that is north of the Alps and east of Paris and Oxford, in 1348. Prague was alive with the new learning, but also near the center of popular excitement about the corruption of the church and the need for reform. By the end of the century, John Huss became part of this wave of energy and enthusiasm, and the central issue of his generation came to be the call for the laity to participate in Holy Communion in both kinds, the bread and the wine, the body and the blood. And this impulse was often accompanied by the desire for more frequent communion. The call for communion in both kinds by the laity was a democratic claim that undermined the separation between the clergy and the laity, and it gave the new movement its name, Utraquism, for bothism, that is, communion in both kinds. It's sort of fun, they take the Latin word for both and call the movement bothism, but in Latin it sounds okay. Ironically, at the moment when Huss confronted the Roman Catholic Church, he had not yet announced his support for communion in both kinds, and the initiative for the confrontation came from the side of the church, as it often did in later conflicts of the 15th century. Huss was a disturber of the peace, but not in the sense that people who vilified him assumed. In order to protect the whole of Prague from excommunication, it had already reached that level of intensity. He left the city and then accepted safe conduct to the Council of Constance in 1415. The situation in the Bohemian Church was the product of a variety of medieval forces, including the immigration of the Valdensians, who are themselves a fascinating chapter in the early Reformation, but many of them came to Bohemia around this time. The influence of the Devotio Moderna, which some of you may know through Thomas à Kempis' works, but their influence on individual spirituality influenced all of this as well as the ideas of John Wycliffe from England. As in the Lutheran Reformation, the sale of church offices, that's simony, and the sale of indulgences to raise money for the church in Rome made reform a powerful religious and political issue. The reform movements led to the founding of what they called the Bethlehem Chapel in Prague. I think that's kind of a neat building. They built that in 1391, and then 10 years later, John Huss became the preacher at the Bethlehem Chapel, and it often received thousands of worshipers at this chapel, and he became the head of the reform movement, which had long preceded him. By 1414, the conflicts in the Roman Church throughout Europe had grown so intense that the Emperor Sigismund called for a church council in Constance. You can see down there, that's Sigismund with his train. In Constance, and offered Huss safe passage for a hearing on heresy. Am I going off the stage?
Yeah.
Okay. After a show trial in which Huss made every effort to be conciliatory, he was condemned to death by fire and died on July 6, 1415, still protesting that he had never preached the heresies he was accused of. Not only was this a cynical betrayal by the church and the emperor and the creation of one of the greatest martyrs in the West, but it announced a century-long struggle between the combined forces of the European church and state and a relatively tiny people at the heart of Europe, what Shakespeare later called the coasts of Bohemia, although there were, of course, no coasts at all. Bohemia was surrounded on all sides by Christendom, but this crusade, or really series of crusades, was also made difficult by the mountains that encircled it on three sides. Not only did the Bohemian Reformation take place 100 years before Luther, but it was able to hold out against the rest of Europe to defend its devotion to the chalice. And that military part of it is really continues to amaze me that it was possible to do this. John Huss was, for the most part, moderate and conciliatory. We might even say conservative. He doesn't look conservative there, does he? Foreshadowing in this regard the Utraquist church as it developed in Bohemia after his death. Arguably, the most radical position Huss took was that Christ was the head of the church, imagine. But the way the emperor and the Council of Constance responded to him in 1415 determined his significance as much as what he did and said. For the people of Bohemia, Huss represented a sincere and trusting devotion to Christ and the true church and their anger with the princes of Europe. One student of the Bohemian Reformation has aptly called the century of the Hussite movement the Magnificent Ride. Communion in both kinds for the laity was, strangely enough, not something that Huss preached in his sermons or defended in Constance, but it became the central expression of his movement. Huss did believe in the chalice, that is, the wine, for the laity, however, and his successors made this fundamental to reform Christianity in Prague. This central issue can be difficult for modern Americans to understand because it falls so precisely on the dividing line between medieval and modern. Juan Cameron, who will speak in our series in the winter quarter, describes what the Mass or the Eucharist meant to the medieval mind. Quote, "One cannot overemphasize the importance which was attached to the real bodily presence of the risen Christ in the wafer and the chalice on the altar. When the priest raised the consecrated body of Christ above his head after the consecration prayer, all eyes in the church turned toward it to acquire the grace assuredly offered to those who saw their Creator." Jakubik of Chibro, Huss's successor as rector of the Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, became the new leader of the Reform movement. The confrontation between the Roman Church and the Bohemian Church was now under Jakubik's spiritual leadership, and the chalice became the symbol of the Hussite movement. The ensuing confrontation between Rome and Prague led in 1419 to the attack on the town hall and to the first defenestration of Prague. We've often heard about the one in the 17th century, but they were just copying this one. The first defenestration of Prague, when a crowd led by a radical priest named Jan Zielinski threw the town councilors out a window. Wenceslas IV, who was king of Bohemia at this time, actually died a sudden death when he absorbed the shock of this news. In my youth, they used to say the students are revolting, but they clearly seem to be. Oops, what did I do? I'm out of order here. One historian of theology, Craig Atwood, summarizes his own view of these events as a series of questions. Was the true church the one that followed the clear and simple teachings of Scripture and the model of the apostles and the church fathers? Or was it the church that had executed Jan Hus for heresies he did not teach? Was the true church the one that was dedicated to rooting out corruption and greed, or the church in which sinners could condemn a blameless man? Did the true church alleviate the sufferings of the poor and redeem prostitutes, or did it exact tithes, rents, and special fees from the poor? Led primarily by the Czech people, the Bohemian Reformation came to express their resistance to the pretensions of rank, power, and wealth. But all of this was also meant to be continuous with Christianity, above all with the teachings of Christ. And for a long time, it seemed as if this church might still be reconciled with the Roman Church. Properly speaking, the Utraquists were neither Protestant nor Catholic. They intended to be more Catholic than anyone, but they were never fully integrated back into the Catholic Church. The symbol of the chalice crystallized several apparently different issues, the issues of democracy, of clerical versus lay power, of the metaphysical understanding of the way in which God expressed himself in the communion, and perhaps most surprisingly, of the contrast between a universal Catholic language and a vernacular, which came to be seen as a national language. For Catholics, it was important to preserve and maintain the exalted host as a symbol of God's presence and majesty, but also as a symbol of the power of the church and its clergy in the world. For reformers, communion in both kinds represented the commitment to reform and democracy. Some of the leading reform voices of the late 14th century in Bohemia adopted, quote, the peculiarly Bohemian standpoint that moral corruption and religious apathy can only be cured by kindling a real devotion to Christ through participation in the miraculous and sacramental benefits of the Eucharist. Thus, we have the Catholic Church representing the majesty of Christ's body and blood as a real physical presence in communion, but one that was reserved, at least in part, for the priests, and the calls for reform and renovation that imagined the real participation of the community of the laity in both the body and blood of Christ. In response to the interdictions of the Council of Constance and the Catholic bishops, Hussite priests assumed the empty pulpits of Bohemia, which the Catholic priests had left behind. The fact that many of the lower nobility supported the Utraquist priests increased the possibility that a national church would survive. By 1420, the Hussite program had been agreed to, and the program lasted through all the conflicts that followed. It was at this point that the great military figure of the revolution emerged in the one-eyed general John Žižka, who was later completely blind. In a battle, someone from a parapet shot an arrow and hit the eye that was not blind. So he fought the rest of the war without any sight whatsoever. None of this legally blind stuff. He was later completely blind and still leading in battle. He held together an alliance between the moderates in Prague and the radicals in Tabor to defeat the combined military forces of nearly all of Europe. This dramatic military story was a technological revolution as well, marked most powerfully by the introduction of mobile artillery. We forget that artillery couldn't always get moved around, and so it wasn't just that they had the artillery, but I always picture it on a radio flyer and running up a hill and turning it around, and all these knights in shining armor are kind of in trouble coming at cannon like that. And they did this over and over again until everybody got the idea. The introduction of mobile artillery, and more generally by the dependence on gunpowder weapons. Žižka's extraordinary military genius, but also his simple faith, allowed the Bohemian Reformation to survive. For him, the true faith in Christ was contained in the 4 Articles of 1420. He believed in the freedom to preach, in communion in both kinds for all the faithful, in Christ as the head of the church, and in a simple, unpretentious clergy without great wealth or status. His men were peasants and artisans who believed that these same things in the same uncomplicated way, and the whole process was suffused with a democratic impulse. Here are the 4 articles, later often referred to as the Compacta of 1436, when they were simply stated again. No matter how long this war went on, they continued to believe the same thing. I find it helpful to think of this as the core of what General John Žižka believed. That is what it meant to be a Christian, which was really all that mattered to Žižka and to the artisans and peasants, squires and knights who followed him. The freedom to preach the word of God, communion in both kinds to both clergy and laity, and the renunciation of worldly property and secular power by the church. And this was something that the Catholic Church really could not grant. This was the basic program of the movement, these first 3 things, but a 4th article was added to satisfy the radicals and Taborites, that is, the punishment of mortal sins and transgressions by the secular authority. And that continued to be a key line in, as conflicts developed between the moderates and the radicals, and gradually you get to this distinction I'll talk more about later between a church and a sect. And the radicals eventually break off. There were 2 main centers of the Hussite movement. The great urban center of Prague, led by the masters of the university and usually referred to as Utraquist, and the intense faith community of Tabor, which was founded on a hill in southern Bohemia. These religious groups went around looking for good hills all over southern Bohemia, and they would go up to the top and call it Tabor and set up. But there were many of these radical movements. Tabor became by far the leading and most influential one, and Žižka was associated with that, at least at the beginning of the war. Most of the towns of Bohemia were radicalized, above all Tabor in the south, which became the center of radicalism, the militarization of the Reformation, and the impulse to revolution. Militarily, this war was marked by recurring but brief and terrible conflicts. They stall around for a long time, and then just horrible things happen. And these included usually the brutal slaughter of women and children and defeated soldiers. As often happened over the course of these conflicts in the 15th century, the leaders of the Catholic Party behaved with such intolerance and unnecessary violence, often under the banners of other nations in Europe, that the quite various forces of reform were gradually driven into unity and into the creation of a national church. So their differences didn't seem so great when their wives and children were being slaughtered. The main claimant to be king after the death of Wenceslas IV, he was the guy who just keeled over after the defenestration, and the leader of the forces supporting the Catholic Church was the Emperor Sigismund, who was also a foreigner. That he was the king of Hungary, which Hungarian's hard enough language, but I'm sure it wasn't easy to go from there to Czech, who was never able to win the confidence of the Czech people. He repeatedly overestimated his own military strength, often because of the sheer numbers of his soldiers, and underestimated Žižka. I don't think this has ever been made into a movie, but it would make a spectacular movie. That the classic thing where the bad guy is always thinking he's got it all finished and then he doesn't. But he came to deeply, if grudgingly, respect Žižka, as well, of course, to hate him. Frederick Hyman's military history of Žižka and his defense of the Hussites between 1419 and 1424 is the most compelling military history I've ever read, and in some ways the most complex because of the nature of medieval warfare, combined with the fascinating transition to modern mobile artillery and gunpowder warfare. By the time Žižka died in 1424, tolerance had begun to emerge as a way of living in Bohemia. This was apparent in the agreements of 1425, the year after he died, where leaders groped for ways to reconcile Catholics, Utraquists, and other religious communities. A regime of tolerance was actually established in Bohemia 60 years later in 1485, but this was long before it came into being elsewhere in Europe. Tolerance was, oddly enough, one of the great achievements of religious dissent, even when the dissenters themselves did not intend this. Repeated defeats of the imperial forces by the Hussites led to the Compacta of 1436 and sort of the recognition that the revolutionaries had won the war. And this Compacta of 1436 was thought for a long time to be the basis for a compromise that would include the Utraquists in the Catholic Church as what might be seen as a first attempt at confessionalism in Christendom. This culminated by 1458 in the election of George of Podjebrady, the Hussite king who consolidated the moderate bourgeois and noble forces. The unity of brethren, which we haven't really talked about to this point, broke away at this time to form a new church that was committed to passive resistance to authority and voluntary poverty. By the end of the century, this new church was enhanced by printing presses and the intensification of humanism, which culminated in the Kralice translation of the Bible in 1613, which was analogous to the King James version in English, and in the life and thought of Comenius, who embodied this new spirituality. George of Podjebrady and John Rokitzani were the men who held together Bohemian society and the achievements of Utraquism in the 15th century. The great creative mind of the Hussite movement, Peter Helczewski, led the way for the unity of brethren, which emerged in the second half of the 15th century after the warlike intensity of the Taborites had passed into history. Peter Helczewski founded this third group within this movement, which led the way for the unity of brethren, which emerged in the second half of the 15th century after the war was over. The unity of brethren ended up breaking with Utraquism to become a completely separate confession, which no longer sought any connection with the Roman Church. The Moravian Brethren may have been the realization of a true religious community, this third stage in developments, but we may almost say that it was removed from history, that it really wasn't involved in the conflicts that are part of historical life. The years from 1415 to 1436 are what made history in Bohemia and created the basis for future developments. John Huss was at the heart of the confrontation between the papacy and the modern secular state. But the war, led by Žižka and the Taborites, made it possible for those ideas to survive. Out of this grew the Bohemian Brethren, but its growth to real greatness belongs mainly to another age, even after the death of King George. Over the course of a century, the Bohemian Reformation worked out three main possibilities for any Christian church after Roman Catholicism: a modern, urban, moderate church, a chiliastic, which is same as millenarian, that is, a belief in the imminent coming of Christ, a chiliastic, apocalyptic, warlike church, and a quietist community of the faithful that refused to participate in war or the secular state. All of these possibilities develop quickly in overlapping ways that make them difficult to define and distinguish. In retrospect, the first was Bohemian Utraquism, the distinctive via media of the Bohemian Church, which was close in kind to Roman Catholicism and to the Anglican Church, equally concerned with overcoming the corruption and doctrinal rigidity of the Catholic Church, and with preserving the heritage of the laying on of hands and of apostolic continuity since Peter. The Utraquists genuinely wanted to preserve the connection to the Catholic Church. Indeed, in the second half of the 15th century, they believed they had done so, as if they were the real Catholics. The second possibility for Christian churches emerged in the wake of the challenge to Rome in the popular task of mobilizing a community for a defensive war. Here, the expectation of the imminent coming of Christ blurred directly into the terrifying capacity for war that responded to the challenge of most of the European knights of the High Middle Ages, and by means of the new ideas of craftsmen and the scientific revolution. And finally, as the troops of Žižka rescued Hussite Bohemia from annihilation, the retreat of the faithful to the strict practice of the faith in the unity of brethren, which, as it migrated to Moravia, Saxony, and America, came to be known as the Moravian Church, which set itself against war and any participation in the state. The unity of brethren was a fundamental break with both Catholicism and Utraquism because of its separation from both the state and the established church. King George eventually had no choice but to move against it in the name of both political and religious solidarity in Bohemia, although he had no appetite for this and had arranged for the unity to live on his own lands earlier in his reign. Strangely enough, it was Rokycana, who's the Archbishop of the Church, and Podjebrady, to whom the unity of brethren, the separatist movement, had turned originally to realize a, quote, Christian community radically divorced from all activities of worldly power and organization. The contrast between the Utraquist Church and the unity of brethren, embodied in Rokycana and Helsinki, is a classic instance of the distinction that Ernst Troeltsch pointed to: the church as a broad, inclusive, but not ideological institution, or not too ideological institution, and the sect as a disciplined community of the elect. Rokycana was fruitful in political and institutional terms, while the unity of brethren made great and long-lasting intellectual and cultural contributions. Most striking about the, Most striking about the unity of brethren were their pacifism, their separation from the state and the established church, and their doctrinal flexibility based on the leadership of Christ and the primacy of the practical values of faith, hope, and love. What is common to all the movements that flowed from Huss, and perhaps most inspiring about them, is the democratic impulse, the sense of the commonality of Christians, the way in which the Christian faith goes out from centers in the individual and in the community, rather than descending from church officials and rites. When the Presbyterians were introducing the Revised Standard Version of the Bible in the United States in the early 1950s, a devoted, if apocryphal, parishioner stopped to speak with her minister after the sermon and explained, if the King James Version was good enough for St. Paul, it's good enough for me. In a similar way, English speakers, as well as German speakers, of course, are often unaware of the flowering of Czech culture in parallel with the Elizabethan age and Shakespeare. Just as the King James Version represents a great moment for the English language, so in the Kralice Bible of 1613, we find a high point of the Czech language. The Czech Bible arose from the unity of brethren, as did the literary and philosophical achievements of John Amos Comenius. This cultural renaissance did not fully come to expression until a century after the founding of the unity of the brethren, and it was driven out almost immediately by the Catholics during the 30 Years' War. The Pansophy of Comenius was a surprisingly modern approach. That's what he called his way of thinking, especially his view of education. It was a surprisingly modern approach to education to ecumenical reconciliation, and to world peace. Comenius saw the starting point in the need to avoid either prejudice or, and this is perfectly incredible to me, I don't believe anybody thinks this, or assuming universality for one's own religion or point of view. That's a hard thing to resist, but he already had that notion in 1600. He aimed for a truly global perspective based on a scientific view of the world and lamented the fact that human beings divide the world into nations. Mother Earth bears them and nurses them all for a time. Air and winds breathe upon them and make them grow. The same sky protects them all. The same sun and stars traverse all regions in turn, so that all men may enjoy a common life with a common people. Therefore, since we are all fellow citizens of one world, what is to prevent us from combining into one political state with one set of laws? There we go. The Bohemian Reformation turns out not just to have been a single event that has been forgotten or undervalued for centuries, but a series of extraordinary events which we may summarize in the following way. First of all, the initial dramatic challenge of John Huss to the ways of thinking that justified the religious order of medieval Christendom. Secondly, the rising up of the Czech people to defend the vision of their martyred leader against all of Europe, including the established order of Bohemia. It was a revolutionary and democratic moment that was comparable to the French Revolution and one of the finest hours in the history of nationalism. It quickly moved from a chiliastic movement of the apocalypse to one of the most warlike movements in European history, and to the amazing victory of artisans and peasants over the finest flower of European knighthood. In an age of hereditary rule, the people of Bohemia moved in a few years from being at the center of the Holy Roman Empire to establishing a new king and a new royal family, while preserving the unity and sovereignty of the nation, as well as the central convictions of Utraquists about lay communion in both kinds. And finally, an outburst of cultural creativity in the unity of brethren, which culminated in the religious and scientific creativity of the late 16th century and early 17th centuries. Heyman argues that George of Podiebrady kingship represented a parallel to what happened under the Tudors in 16th century England. The development of a strong central government combined with constitutionalism that might have achieved a balance of forces in Bohemia. Quote, "It was the extraordinary fate of a small nation of Slav origin, the Czechs, to have experienced, or it may be said, achieved, the very first of those great historical, consequential, and productive upheavals which shaped the development of the modern world." And he adds, there have only been 5 or 6 of these truly great revolutions. Part of the historical wisdom and relativism of the unity of brethren was a precocious awareness of the embeddedness of truth, that there are not true dogmas that are true for all time apart from historical context, but spiritual movements that emerge out of history and give form to the historical experiences of these human beings. The people of Bohemia became a model for modern Western spirituality, for the Lutheran Reformation, and for the possibilities of reconciling science and religion and different versions of Christianity and Reformation. The Reformation played an enormous role in Austria and Bohemia and Moravia, and was never entirely driven out, although people tend to forget that. By the early 17th century, Bohemia had one of the most interesting and varied Protestant cultures in Europe. And shortly before his deposition, Rudolf II reached an agreement with the estates, the so-called Letter of Majesty of 1609, which guaranteed religious freedom not only for the Utraquists, but also for the Lutherans and the unity of brethren. Thank you.